In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, our local congregations are led by bishops. Most other churches know these guys as pastors or preachers. Additionally, our local congregations are referred to as wards. These congregations are like city wards, based on geographical areas. If an area has a sufficient number of young single adults, a special ward will be created, known as a young single adult ward. Of course, one of the primary purposes of these single adult wards is for single members to potentially find a spouse. When I was in the age range to be in one of these young single adult wards, I moved around constantly. The constant moving caused me to be in many wards, and by extension, I had many bishops. And since the bishops vary in personality, I got along with some better than others. There are also ones with whom I didn't get along at all. The ones I usually didn't get along with were those who didn't base their views in reality. What I mean by not basing their views in reality is those who refused to see what was going on in their own ward. At the time, there was a 3-hour block of meetings at church. Before and after these meetings, many people would talk with each other. Most young men would attempt to talk to a young woman during times before, after, and in between meetings. Unless you were the most popular man, the Chad, the young women would try their best to avoid talking to the rest of the young men. They would at times accept the attention. But if a young man who wasn't a Chad attempted to ask them out, they would say things like, "I'm not ready for a serious relationship yet. I'm not ready to get married. I'm focusing on school," and other excuses. I observed this behavior because I held church positions, such as ward clerk, where I would often arrive early and leave late. Since people were constantly moving in and out of these wards, these interactions were consistent. After a while, many young men would only hang out with their male friends because trying to talk to the young women became fruitless. Meanwhile, the Chads had a harem that followed them everywhere. Unfortunately, many bishops were blind to these situations. When they noticed not many people were dating, they would get up over the pulpit to rebuke the young men. They would say things such as, "The young men aren't asking out the women. The young men need to man up," or "They weren't trying hard enough," or "They're trying too hard." It was shocking that they couldn't see what was happening right in front of them. After they yelled at the young men, the young women would double down on their bad behavior. Due to my position, I attempted to inform them of what was happening, but they refused to listen. Even when young men would mention how many women they talked to, the activities they attended, or any other attempts at dating, the bishop and counselors would not hear it. The cognitive dissonance was challenging to deal with. It was like the Simpsons episode where Marge Simpson wants to order a coffee in Australia, and the bartender only hears her ordering beer, even when she spells out coffee. However, out of all the bishops, there was one who stood out to me. I met him originally as the bishop of a different ward that shared the same building. I had friends and some family members who were in his ward. When this man became a bishop, he started running around and doing the things I previously mentioned. He was also a literal, by-the-book type of guy. In some ways, it felt like a Pharisee was in the bishop's office. For example, a young woman wanted to get married, but he refused to marry her because her wedding dress was sleeveless. He claimed it broke church policy. To my knowledge, there is no dress code for civil weddings held in church buildings in the LDS faith. However, there is a dress code for temple weddings. Young women are asked not to wear sleeveless dresses in preparation to attend the temple. Additionally, this young woman hadn't been attending church regularly, so it was somewhat expected that she wouldn't be wearing the recommended dresses. Because of this incident and others, I was glad I wasn't in his ward. However, due to the nature of my work, I frequently moved around. One day I found myself in his ward. I dreaded going to church, but I decided to go anyway. He had been a bishop for a few years at this point. When I went, I found something completely unexpected. He had made a 180 on many of his positions. At this point, I had never seen a bishop do this. Instead of chastising the young men for dating problems, he chastised the young women. He noticed that the young women were the ones who were putting off marriage and commitment. He was also a lot more lenient when it came to things like sleeveless dresses. He had learned that it was more important for a person to be at church than to pursue minor deviations in code. The bishop had not changed overnight. Instead, it had happened over time. One of the main reasons for his change was that he had a son who was struggling to get into a long-term relationship. His son had a decent degree, earned a good income, had a life plan, and enjoyed interesting hobbies. However, the bishop's son would get only one date and be ghosted. When he saw all his son's dating attempts failing, especially given the effort his son was putting in, he began to change his opinion on only men avoiding commitment. The bishop also noticed that other young men were being treated the same by the young women. He was observing the dating market rather than relying on a biased view or his own experience as a young adult. He also realized that his strictness had driven people away from his ward. He started to show more compassion and listen to the problems that members of his congregation faced. He also didn't like the lack of interest the women were showing the young men. He began to make and implement plans to get the women to show more interest. He tried many ideas, but most of them failed. I must admire him for his efforts. He had tried to get things to change, but the choices of others were out of his control. In addition, he treated me with respect and didn't accuse me of not trying hard enough. He listened to what I had to say when I told him about my dating struggles. He made it so that I felt that I belonged. My voice mattered, and I was a contributor in that ward. I enjoyed being in his ward, and it was a pleasant experience. However, as things went along, I had to move and leave the area. I did keep in touch with him, and he was there to support me. Although it was a short time, it was a valuable experience.